Okay, last time, which I guess was 2 weeks ago when we met, we were almost finished debt, but I didn't want to rush through it. I wanted to spend a little bit more on the home mortgage, because I think most of us don't hesitate getting into debt to buy a home. And I think it's a good thing to buy a home versus renting, you know, if you can afford to do so. I think sometimes we don't recognize, we just look and say, oh, well, the Bible says debt is bad, therefore all debt is bad. Well, I think God has always shown throughout the Bible that He wants us to make good decisions, and that includes good business decisions and good financial decisions. And you know, if we take God literally, that we should never get into debt, then you should never buy a house if you can't pay cash for it. You should rent for the rest of your life, and that wouldn't be a good financial decision. So hopefully, you know, we can all agree on that. I think the home, because of its unique nature, is the last thing we should pay off. I'm not saying we should never pay off our home, don't read me wrong. But when I look at certain debts, I would put mortgages at the back end of that. I think you have to look at all the reasons why you may even want to consider keeping a mortgage. You know, if I died right now today with a 3% mortgage and interest rates jump up to 16%, do I really want my wife to take my life insurance on my savings that's earning 16% and pay off a 3% deductible mortgage? I would want to put it aside and say, I can pay off the mortgage anytime I want, but so long as it's financially sound, should I really do it? That may seem like a contradiction to God that says we should pay off our debt. I would never say it's a bad decision to pay off the house, never. You know, but I want to give you some reasons why you would take a look at it a little differently than any other debt. There's some things I'm going to come back with later, and when I first go through this, you're going to raise your hand and you have some questions. But let me get through this before you start asking questions, because I think I'll answer some along the way. If I were to finance $200,000 today, over 30 years at 4%, my note would be $954.83 a month. Over 30 years, I would pay $343,739. And that's what scares everybody when you look at the amount of interest that you pay. But if I had $200,000 in the bank making 4%, and I bought the house up front, didn't finance it, I would lose the interest that $200,000 was earning over 30 years at 4%, which is $648,000. So the basic cost, before we take into the other factors, is if I finance a house over 30 years, it costs me $343,000. If I take $200,000 out of a bank account that's paying me 4%, it costs me $648,000. That's the fundamentals. If interest rates go up to 8%, my mortgage is not going to go up, it's fixed. It's still going to cost me $343,000. If interest rates go up to 8%, and I don't have that money in the bank anymore, my mortgage is going to cost me $2 million to buy that house. If interest rates go up to 16%, like it was in 1980, we had 16% interest rates, for those of you old enough to remember. That house would cost me over $17 million if I had paid cash. Now, if we want to get the money, we can go to the banker, and the banker will be happy to lend us money at 2% above whatever the other rate is. So if it's here, the banker will lend you your money at 6%, or your money at 10%, or your money at 18%. let's face it, they're already taking your money right now and lending it out at 18% for credit cards. So the bank is making money on your money. You in a way, have an opportunity to be your own bank and control it. Now, here's the question that you probably have on your mind now. Well, Larry, if I didn't have this note to pay, I could save $954 a month, and you could. And that'll bring this cost down if you discipline yourself to save it. But you're not going to get 4%. No bank today is going to pay you 4% on a monthly payment of $954. And you have to pay taxes on the interest. So you can recoup some of it, but not all of it. Here I can recoup the tax savings because the mortgage is the only debt that's tax deductible. So it's not really costing me 4%. If I'm in a 50% tax bracket, and I'm not, but it's an easy math number, it's costing me 2%. But the most important thing, I think, in considering these things is the bank is not paying you a dividend on your equity. We can all feel good about the equity we have in our home, but we don't get a quarterly dividend check. And when we want to borrow it, we need to beg for it. We need to fill out a stack of forms this big, given our life history, and beg them to lend us the money at 2% more, and if our credit's not really good, it's 3 or 4% more. So all I'm saying to you is let it be the last thing you pay off. I don't want you not to get out of debt. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying let it be the last thing. Think about some financial advantages there, and think about why you should at least have, if $200,000 is what you have in the bank, don't take the whole $200,000 out and pay that off. Save some money if you need it, because remember, if you pay it off and you don't have anything in the bank, it's going to be, you're going to borrow it back at more. So kind of make some wise financial decisions there with your home mortgage. Does anybody want to ask those questions now?
Not a question, but just as a guideline, I think, for it, and just to keep things simple. 3 debts: credit card, automobile, home. Pay off the credit card first, the car second, and the home last.
Right.
Principle, right?
I think that's a good principle. Question.
Larry, went a little fast for me. Can you rehearse again the difference between the, starting out at the 343 and then moving up
Well,
to the 4%?
you know, if we use a financial calculator, a 30-year mortgage at 4% is going to cost us $954 a month. And if we add that up over a 30-year mortgage, 360 months,
That's what you got.
we're going to come up with $343,000, which is the true cost of that $200,000 house. And I'm saying that's what scares us. But if we took that $200,000 out of the bank, or any investment that was paying us the same interest rate of 4%, we would lose $648,000 over that same period of time. So the house is a cost. It's going to take wealth away from us, no matter how we pay it, whether we pay interest or we lose interest. And by putting it up front, we're actually losing almost twice as much.
Where's the number 200,000 come?
$2 million.
No, that's the price of the
That's
house.
the price of the house,
Okay,
or at least the price of the mortgage.
right.
And then I'm just merely showing you, if interest rates shot up to 8%, it would be a higher cost because your money's no longer in the bank earning that new 8%. But this is not going to change, because assuming it's a fixed and not an adjustable mortgage, please don't take adjustable mortgage.
Yeah, don't do that.
Yeah, I have a question. What do you do with the $200,000 in cash? Like, cause the bank doesn't give you much money for your money. Like, it's like 1% or something.
Well, first of all, if I had the $200,000 to pay off the mortgage, and I chose not to.
Yes.
I want it to be a very secure investment that is somewhere that I know, because in my mind, I don't have the debt. If I have a corresponding $200,000, I don't have a debt. It's just whether I'm choosing to pay it off now or not. Like I said, if interest rates are 16% tomorrow, I'm not going to pay off a 3% tax deductible mortgage. So it's having it there, but you need to be secure with where it is. And there are guaranteed 4% investments today.
Money markets?
No, I mean, it's not going to be at a bank. It would be probably with an insurance company that guaranteed you 4%. It would be a 5-year annuity contract, for example. If you invested $200,000 or any amount, $50,000, with an insurance company for 5 years, it would be like buying a 5-year CD, and you'd have a guaranteed interest rate of 4% over that 5-year period.
Well, how much does that come out to? You could do that in your head, I'm sure.
Well, yeah, if you could buy one for 30 years, it would cost you.
No, not 30, but for 5 years, what you just said.
I can't.
Oh, okay, never mind.
I can't do
Or
that.
you could just rattle that off.
At 7 years, I can't, because,
We'll do that.
or 10 years, excuse me, at 10 years, I can. Because see, there's a thing called the rule of 72.
Yeah, that's right.
And you divide the interest rate into 72. And it tells you that at 5%, money would double in 14-point-something years.
So in 14 years, instead of 200,000, you now have
You'd have
400,000.
At 7%, money doubles every 10 years.
So it's not that
Before
good.
taxes.
Yeah.
Well, let's not get too far off the subject here, because I want to cover a lot in a short period of time. I'm not against paying off debt. Please don't misread me. I'm just saying, put your house on the back burner, and I wouldn't even consider. I can show you the numbers that a 15-year mortgage is worse than a 30-year mortgage. And I don't care if it's a lower interest rate, the numbers are it's worse. And putting extra money toward principal is worse. All of that stuff is bad. But, again, if you have the money, pay it off, just make sure it's a good financial decision.
Well, I was, just to simplify, if you left your mortgage like it was, you're gonna pay the $343, right?
Yeah.
But if you had the $200,000 in the bank and you put it in a secure, guaranteed 4%, so you deduct the $343 from the $648, you come ahead $324,000.
Well, that's true, but there's other factors. In other words, were you disciplined to save the $954 a month?
No, I'm saying you keep your mortgage, right?
Yeah, well,
You got
okay.
200 grand to invest over 30.
Right, yeah.
So you subtract the 343, so you come net ahead by keeping your mortgage, $324,000.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. I don't want to get bogged down on this. I think, I just shared, there's the financial advisor in me that just wants to give some math numbers. And I apologize if I get too carried away with that. I do want to ask you a little bit, or talk a little bit about investment debts, business debt, and church debt. Pastor Eric and maybe some of the elders, Steve, some of you might have some thoughts on that. I don't think there's anything biblically about church debt. I would say from my perspective, as a member of the church, I put a lot of faith and trust in the elders. And I'm sure that if they've prayed about it and they've looked at all the facts and they feel like God is putting it on their heart to go into this debt for a new building or whatever the case may be, I trust that they're going to make the right decisions, that they're going to put as much down as they can, they're going to feel comfortable that they can make the notes and they'll pay. Anybody else?
I just have a question, right? We often hear tithing, 10%. Is that an Old Testament, or is it?
Jeff, I'm going to defer that if you don't mind, because we actually have a section on giving and I'm gonna cover that thoroughly, so let's defer it if you don't mind. It's a good question, great question, and we're gonna answer it. You know, investment debt, you know, again, I don't blame anybody who sees an opportunity to maybe buy an old house, fix it up, and sell it and make a profit on it. Personally, I don't see any problems with it. I would encourage them, again, to put as much down so it's not a burden, and make sure that they're in a position that if they don't sell it right away or they don't rent it, they're not going to go bankrupt. They're going to be able to afford to pay it. So I think you have to have those situations. And it gets back to what I said about church debt. It starts with praying about it. And we'll talk a little later about counsel. Counsel is very important. And I would encourage somebody before they got into some real estate debt, investment debt, that they would maybe talk to some other people who are familiar with it and did it, and especially Christian people, godly people, that they can get a good feel for, you know, what they're getting into and what are some of the pros and cons. Business debt. You know, I own a business. Over 10 years ago, prior to Katrina, so it's been a while, I decided to buy an office building. I didn't see an advantage to me paying rent when I could buy a building and pay rent to myself. So it was a business decision on my part to go into debt to buy that building. You know, fortunately, I was able to put a good enough down payment on it and be able to make the notes and whatnot. And it's turned out to be, you know, a very good investment for me. But others have made business decisions to buy property versus lease property. I think all of these things are okay. I think there's not a lot biblically I can refer you to, but again, I think that we can look to see that God wants us to make good decisions. We talked about the talents. We can look to the talents and want to, not to just stick money in the ground and bury it. So pray about it. Make sure that you're in a financial position that you can put enough money down and feel comfortable in paying the note if something goes, you know, sideways.
You might have already touched on this. I'm coming in late and I missed because of work, so, but did you talk at all about, and I'm just wondering about your thoughts on Proverbs 22:7, where it talks about the rich rule over the poor and the borrower is slave to the lender. Have you discussed that?
I've probably listed those Bible verses. I don't know that I went over it specifically. And incidentally, in your outlines, what I've tried to do is put every Bible verse I could find that related to the matter. And I may not discuss them, or I may not go over them. I may be trying to move on the subject, but the point is you can always go back there and reference, and yes, John, that is a good one to bring up. We can also look to the Bible for verses on repayment responsibilities. I think everybody knows as Christians we're responsible. I think that sometimes people use bankruptcy too quick today. You know, I think that we can clearly look biblically in scriptures where it says we're responsible to pay our debts. I think the one problem we have sometimes is when you get in those positions, the financial institutions really don't want to work with you. They'd rather write you off, and they almost force you sometimes into a bankruptcy situation. Wherever possible, wherever you can, work to pay off those debts. Co-signing, don't do it. You're going to give me all your reasons why, hey, you get there, and you got to do this, and you got to establish failure. Don't do it. Scripturally, it's wrong. It's a bad thing to do. Do not co-sign. Any other questions on it? You know, check your credit report every once in a while. I think it's a good idea to do that. You can do them now, and there are a lot of ones out there you can do for free. I think it's creditkarma.com is one of them. I would encourage you to do that.
Larry, I always used to hear that it lowered your credit if you looked at it, every time you pull that report. Is that true or not true?
Yeah, no, that's related to when you actually are trying to purchase something and your credit report is pulled up. But when you have a service like Credit Karma and you go in there to check it, that's not.
Yeah, I always wondered about that. Thank you.
Yeah, but you're right, you know, you go to shopping for a car and every wants to come in there and get you on your credit. Never let them do that, always tell them no.
That's a good point.
Larry, I have a question for you on credit bureaus. It always seems to me to be a little bit of a catch-22. You know, when you were coming up, my mom told me to get a Sears card, you know, so you got a Sears card, you paid it all down, you start establishing your credit. And the story always is, you know, make sure that you have evidence of good credit. So you get a Visa card, a MasterCard, and this, that, and the other thing. All of a sudden, at the end of the day, you get a credit report that says, well, you have too many open accounts.
Yeah.
I don't owe anything on them, you know, but, you know, suddenly because you have the opportunity to get, pick a number, $100,000 in credit, we consider you maybe not so good. It's like, wait a minute, you just told me to go do all of this,
Yeah, well, you know,
and now all of a sudden you're telling me.
You know,
got
the
too much
answer
in
is,
it.
it's really good for a young person to have a credit card, and as long as they're paying it off promptly, and it's really not a debt. In other words, they're using it to buy gas, but then at the end of the month, they're paying the bill. But there is too many, because it's a sign of, okay, well, this one's running out of limit, let me get this other one, or this one. And then they make the mistakes of, well, this one's a 1% less, so I can get this, and oh, this one offers these reward points, and they wind up with a lot, and that's right, too many open accounts, so you need to start closing some of those accounts up.
I see people doing that where they get that offer to transfer your balance.
Yeah,
or, you
right.
know, just, you don't pay off your credit card, just move it over here to this other credit
Right.
card. Now you got a zero balance here, but it's all just transferred over, and eventually
Right.
it catches up with you.
Exactly. Exactly. Let's talk for a minute about counsel. And I really, as we get into some of these other things, I really don't want to spend time just reading, digging, throwing scriptures at it. I just want to have a casual conversation, and I'll come back here when I need to. But let's think about what are a couple of reasons why we don't seek counsel.
I know what, I might get the answer that I don't wanna hear.
What's that?
Like, I have an answer I wanna hear, but if I say, well, Larry's not gonna give me that answer, so I'm gonna ask Steve, because he might say what I wanna hear.
That's
That's why you
called
wouldn't.
stubbornness. You know what you want, you don't
Yeah.
want anybody telling you that. You've already made the decision. You know, at the very least, you'd be, well, I want them to confirm, you know, but don't tell me. Yeah, stubbornness and pride. You know, our pride says that we can do it all. You think I'm gonna look at a map when I'm lost and try to find
Oh, listen to
find
your wife.
it? I gotta be around this thing. Counsel is very important, especially in some of our major decisions. You know, I think it's very important. And if we think about, you know, counsel, the very first thing I would encourage anybody to do is to look the scriptures and see what scripture says about the matter or the decision. Because if you can get an answer from the big guy, why do we want to go to Eric? You know, if the big guy has already said there's no offense, you know, we can stop there. If God is playing on something, then that's it. That's all we need. But most of the times, God is not real clear on certain decisions and things. And that's where I think you get involved with other godly people, your ministers, Christians that you know. You know, if it's a business decision, Steve, I think I questioned you and talked to you one time, maybe even about buying my building. I'm not sure what, but there was something related to business, because I know Steve is a good Christian business person. So experienced people, especially Christian people, we can even go to our parents, and sometimes even if our parents aren't Christians, even if our parents aren't particularly experienced in this matter, I think we show them honor by going to them and talking to them and getting their advice on something. And most importantly, if you're married, your spouse. You know, I think that sometimes, I know in my case, there's my side, which is more objective and factual, and Linda's side, which is more emotional. And I think we balance each other out, because the two are an important part. And I think you also show respect to your spouse in making him or her feel like they are important to the decision. I also think it's an opportunity to prepare our spouses. You know, if I die, I want my wife to be able to know about the business, or the books, or the debt, or the life insurance, or whatever else is involved. So there's many reasons why you should choose to seek counsel, and there's a lot of different people you can choose that would fit that. You know, I certainly wouldn't go to anybody who, you know, maybe has some vested interest in giving you this information this way. You might choose a multitude of counselors to balance those off. I certainly wouldn't go to fortune tellers. That's certainly not the answer. But I want you to understand that it's not unmanly to go out and seek counsel and talk to people, especially good Christian counselors. Any other thoughts on counsel? One thing I'd mention is, for those that are seeking counsel, if you're going to go to someone to seek counsel, it's important that you're very open and very truthful. That you don't hide this or that information because you may be embarrassed about it. You know, a counselor can only help you if they have all the information. I know in my business as a financial advisor, if I'm going to work with somebody, I'm asking for a lot of things. Sometimes it's difficult to pull all that together, but it's the only way we can really help you, is to know the whole picture. And from the counselor side, you know, if we're the ones doing the counseling, you know, we got to remember certain points that we want to do, and I've kind of jotted them down so I don't forget any, but you know, we need to communicate in a loving and understanding person. We can't put ourselves above that person. You know, we got to understand where they're coming from, make them feel comfortable and communicate with them in a loving fashion. We have to be content that the Lord is in control of the situation. We may not be able to fix it. We may not be able to get them to go along with what we're recommending, but the Lord is in control. Another thing that's very important is confidentiality. If someone is coming to you, you know, you need to keep that in strictest confidentiality. That's just critical if you're going to be a counselor. And then this is my favorite. When you don't know the answer, say you don't know the answer. Okay? You don't have to be an expert on everything. If they're asking you a question about this or that and you don't know, say, hey, I don't know. You may even want to refer them to another counselor that might be able to help. Any more questions on counseling before we...
Not a question, just a comment. If somebody comes to me for counseling, one of the first things I tell them is seek other counsel in addition to mine. To get, and then from that develop a plan. My experience has been, when I sought counsel as a businessman, is to use multiple Christian business people. Clay, your dad, Ben, was one of my counselors that I used. He was one of about five, and then of the five, 3 were pastors of business, and none of them had any business experience. It was amazing, the wisdom that I received. So the principle that Scripture gives us is to seek multiple counsel for a reason, and you get a tremendous amount of wealth from which you can then filter that and make a decision. That's my only point.
Anybody else? Okay, let's move on to the subject of honesty. Again, I think this is a perfect one just to have a discussion. You know, I think it's difficult today in our society where it's sometimes overlooked as not being that critical, especially in the small things. But small things lead to big things. In Judges 17:6, they talk about every man doing as he sees fit. That kind of goes along with society. And over all the years, maybe that part hasn't changed so much. There's a lot of attitude out there that says, well, I kind of do as I see fit. You know, I gave the clerk a 10, gave the change for a 20. And I said, ooh, what good fortune. You know, how many people go back? Well, there's an extra item in the shopping cart. When you get out of Winn-Dixie, you realize
Is that situational?
they weren't paid. You know, remember, little things lead to big things. If you're not going to be honest in little things, you're going to be honest. You're not going to be honest in big things. Again, I hate to keep bringing up, you know, my business, but I can speak from experience and tell you that it's important, you know, when you're dealing with somebody and you're talking about investment products especially, it's important that you're very honest with them about all the pros and cons. You can't just tell them the pros. You have to give them the cons. I always tell my clients there's no such thing as a free lunch. Here's the cons. But I think the pros might outweigh it because of this, or that. And it refers to anything or anybody or any business. You know, it refers to you working in an office and taking some sticky notes home or Staples or something, you know, because it's okay, or making long distance phone calls on company lunch. You know, there's certain things we seem to accept in society. But I assure you that that's not what God wants. God demands honesty. You cannot love God and be dishonest. Anybody want to share anything? Comments, questions on honesty? I think everybody is pretty good with it. It certainly can be a blessing or it can be a curse. And I'm not going to go there, but I gave you a lot of scriptures that you can look at on your own if you decide that you want to explore this further. Now I want to get into, we only have about 10 more minutes, so I was really trying to get here because giving is something we're probably going to spend a little bit more time on. And Jeff, this is where we'll get to your question. But what we want to do is examine what are the elements of giving, and I've defined 4 of the elements of giving. One is attitude, one is advantages, one is the amount to give, and one is the approach to give. So if we would look at attitude, I'd like to refer you to a very famous verse, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with money and possessions and giving? I think the key to learn out of this is that for God so loved, in other words, he loved, for he so loved that he gave his only begotten Son. He loved before he gave. He loved before he gave. Should we love before we give a tithe? The whole concept of giving is not as clear today as it was before. You know, prior to the Old Testament, we'll get into this now, Jeff. Prior to the Old Testament, there was only, I think, 2 recorded times when the giving was taking place, or tithing as we call it today. And these times were basically to, in the case of, let's say, Joseph for doing this, or Abraham for saving Lot, you know, I promised to give 10% to do this. And from these times, and this is before the Old Testament,
Before the law.
the law, I'm sorry, before the Old Testament law, the law developed out of that. And that's where we picked up this 10% as a guideline. And you can kind of go through scriptures and see some references to the 10%. But keep in mind, this was all part of the Old Testament law. And as we get into the New Testament in the time of Jesus Christ, we don't see the references to specifics. It's more on the idea of love and what's in your heart and what's right. And talking about the widow that gave a penny, but it was more than anybody else because it was the only penny that she had. Looked like somebody back here wanted to say something. Did they? No. Okay. 1 Corinthians 13:3 says, if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. So an attitude of love in giving is crucial. Given without love provides no benefit to the giver. Matthew 23:23. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. In God's economy, the attitude is more important than the gift itself. I don't know if that specifically answers your questions, Jeff. I think the 10% is a guideline that we could use. We might start with that number and put it there and see if it's realistic for us to give that number. Maybe it's just a goal that we want to get to. But I think we need to pray about what we should give and see what God puts on our heart in keeping with each of us in terms of what we have.
The scribes and the Pharisees.
Sorry, Lou.
So, you know, I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
The Matthew 23, you know, I'd always read that one and he's talking about, you know, the justice, mercy, and faithfulness, but at the tail end of that verse, he talks about doing both of those things. So he mentions, it's Jesus talking, and I'm asking if I'm reading it correctly, but when I've always read it, you know, he's saying, woe to the scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, and he mentions you pay 1/10, and then he says, but you've neglected the other matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. But then at the tail end, he says you should have done these things. You should have been done without neglecting the others. So I've always read it like he's saying you should have done all. You know, don't neglect the
Yeah,
change.
yeah,
But you should
I
also
think
not
clearly,
neglect the tithe.
what he's saying is, look, you're putting the emphasis here on the giving the amount of 10%, and you're forgetting all of these other things that's so important. I don't want you to forget these things, but hey, don't ignore the giving part too. You still need to give, but let's put this part in.
I guess I've always looked at, like, he's specifically mentioning a tenth there, and I don't know if I was reading.
Well, again,
too much of that, but
this is in the Old Testament.
What, right, is Jesus talking about the law.
Yeah, but I mean,
he's talking,
yeah,
and he's,
It's Old
it's
Testament
him
law.
speaking,
right,
talking
but
about,
he's
hey,
talking about
you should
the
do,
law view.
right, he's saying you should do the tenth. That's how I've always read it, but.
Well, I'm not against people giving a tenth of their income. I mean, I think that's a good starting point to look at. You know, my philosophy has always been to do a minimum amount that I feel like God puts on my heart to do, and to do it consistently and periodically, and make sure that that's part of my budget that comes off the top. And then look for other opportunities where it may arise to do more if God gives me the blessings to be able to do more, and I have an opportunity to do more. But I think what you decide is an amount in today's society, which is more based on the New Testament than the Old Testament, would be to pray about it and give what God puts on your heart to give. And, you know, Eric, this might be a good time for you to jump in if you have any thoughts and get it differently.
Well, you know, I think, you know, God loves a cheerful giver. He wants us to give generously, and he wants us to give cheerfully. But I think there is an element of sacrificially too. I mean, God's example is that he gave sacrificially for us. And there's a passage about David, you know, when David was buying a piece of property so he could, you know, worship the Lord. The guy wanted to give him a piece of property. He said, no, I'm not going to offer something to God that costs me nothing. In other words, it needs to cost us something, or there's an element of, if we're not giving sacrificially, I think A.W. Tozer said the only safe answer he could give about how much to give is that it needs to be more than you can spare.
Right.
And that's a sort of a pithy quote, but, you know, I think if it's not costing, if you can give it and you don't even notice that it's gone, that's not really an offering to the Lord. It needs to be something that you, it's an honor to him, it's a sacrifice for him, it's something that needs to cost you something in order for it to be an offering. That doesn't mean you have to give everything, but you have to give something that, you know, that you actually feel.
And I like what you said about giving cheerfully. What's the original Greek, I'm going to challenge you here, what's the original Greek word for cheerful?
I don't remember.
Hilaris,
Yeah,
where we
Yeah,
get
that's
the
right.
word hilarious.
yeah.
So next Sunday, when they're passing out the plates, if the congregation starts laughing, you will know that they're giving cheerfully. Questions? Somebody in their hand?
I just had a comment. You used a really good word. You said, I look for opportunity. And I think that is the attitude that God would have us to have, that giving is not a burden, but we have an opportunity to give. I mean, let's face it, do you think God really needs our money?
That's exactly it.
Doesn't. But what do we have? I mean, we have a window of opportunity in our lives to be able to give back to God. And I think that's the key word you said is opportunity. And so when we give, it's like, yeah, it's an opportunity.
Yeah, it's an opportunity to participate. You know, if we think back to the process, the number one process is that we recognize that God owns it all.
Right.
We talked about that earlier in the study. We accept that God owns all of our money, all of our possessions, and all we are stewards. And we're to manage what money or possessions God chooses to give us, and we're to do it faithfully. And part of that faithfulness and stewardship relies to giving. And so we should be faithful with what God gave us to give 8% back to the church, and whether it's 1% or $1, I don't know. And see, I just made a mistake. We're not giving to the church.
Yeah.
We're giving to God. We're not giving to ministries, to the church, to the poor. you know, we're giving to God until we get that mentally right. That we're giving lovingly, cheerfully, it's all part of what God owes, and it's an opportunity for us to participate in honoring Him and loving Him. And every single thing we've talked about all seems to have one theme, is all of this stuff, whether it's honesty or giving or anything, it all relates to us becoming more Christ-like in our sanctification. You know, as Christians, we're already justified. Now, how do we become sanctified? Well, we become more Christ-like, and these are opportunities in what we do, whether it's being honest or in giving or at work or whatever else. These are opportunities to be more Christ-like. Okay, I need to wrap up, and I think I'm pretty much where I wanted to get to you today. You know, there are certainly advantages of giving, but most of all, it's the increase in our intimacy with Christ. And we already talked about the amount to give. And I would just end up the section on giving, telling you once again to pray about it. Pray about it, see what's on your heart. And when you go out and give joyfully, cheerfully, and with love. Next week we'll talk about work, which is an interesting subject. Why do we go to work? God's already promised to take care of us. Why do we go to work? We'll find out a little bit more about that next week. And then ultimately I want to get into some more hardcore stuff about investment and insurance and things that I think you should know as you go through your finances.